I've titled my talk today Something of the Narod, Croatian Immigrant Church Murals Before and After the Johnson-Reed Act. And this is a longer version of a talk I gave earlier this year at the American Historical Association in Chicago, and that was for a panel that was about Eastern European Catholicism. So I'm thinking about these Croatian Catholic churches in the United States that have been set up. In my talk today, I'm going to compare how the murals of two early 20th century Croatian Catholic national parishes address the discourse around American immigration. So in 1909, a prominent Croatian historicist painter named Oton Iveković made the long trip from Zagreb, which was then in Austria-Hungary, to paint a set of murals in St. John the Baptist Croatian Catholic Church in the Strawberry Hill neighborhood, not far from the meatpacking plants of Kansas City, Kansas. And we'll compare those today with the Vanka murals. About 3 decades later, in 1937, artist Maksimilijan Vanka, who was a recent immigrant to the United States from Zagreb, which by that point is part of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, was invited to paint murals in St. Nicholas Croatian Catholic Church in Millvale, located in close proximity, as you know, to the steel mills in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The two murals share a surprising amount in common. Iveković and Vanka were actually both academic painters. They were both painting at the Academy in Zagreb. They were both in these commissions painting for Croatian working class immigrant communities in the Rust Belt. But obviously these two churches are on opposite ends of the Rust Belt, and as I'm going to explore in this talk, they're also responding to vastly different moments in the history of American immigration. So how did I get into this topic of comparing these two churches? I first learned of the Millvale murals when I was a graduate student at the University of Pittsburgh 15 years ago, and Vanka eventually became the subject of my dissertation. And when I was researching Vanka, I actually came across one of these original letters from an elder of St. Nicholas that was addressed to Vanka, and he's inquiring about the possibility of Vanka coming to St. Nicholas to paint murals. And the St. Nicholas elder, Fanjo Kolander, mentioned that they wanted the church to be decorated with, and I'm going to quote my translation here since the original is in Croatian, something of the Narod from the homeland, like what Professor Oton Iveković did in the Croatian church in Kansas City, Kansas. So obviously, this reference really stuck out to me. First, Kansas City, Missouri is my hometown, and so I kind of put a pin in that, and finally about 5 years ago, I had a chance to go and look at these, or start researching. I shouldn't say go look at, as I'm about to point out, they don't exist anymore. I got to go research these Strawberry Hill murals. And I soon discovered why, even though I'm from Kansas City, I had not heard of these murals. There was a fire in 1932 in St. John the Baptist that destroyed Ivekovic's murals a little over 20 years after they had been originally painted. And so the church survived. It was like a boiler-laden fire. The smoke damaged the murals, but you can still go visit the church today and it's still a congregation. Okay. So when Kolander writes Vanka to ask him to create some murals like Oton Ivekovic's murals, interestingly, Ivekovic's murals didn't exist anymore at that point. That's interesting. And the other thing that really, let me take a step back there. I also want to say here that my St. John the Baptist research has really been a project that's about reconstructing what's in those murals. So we basically have a few photographs of St. John the Baptist. We have a lot of descriptions in newspaper articles and sketches from newspaper articles. And, our understanding of those murals is still fragmentary and it's still incomplete. And I've been trying to figure out what we can know about what is in those murals. The second thing I want to point out about this passage that really stuck out to me is the fact that the author uses this Croatian term, Narod, and I love a good Croatian term that's hard to translate into English. And in this instance, it's this term that means multiple things in English. It has connotations of folk. It also has connotations of nation. And by using this term Narod, I'm like pondering what did this immigrant congregation want from this artist? They wanted something of the old world, something of the homeland when they commissioned these murals. Likely that meant an element of folk culture, an element of folk history to remind them of Croatia. And folk culture was certainly the route that I went when I started researching Vanka about 15 years ago. I think what's interesting with both of these congregations is that they were very lucky in that they probably got way more than they bargained for. Way more than they bargained for when they commissioned Iveković, and way more than they bargained for when they commissioned Vanka to paint these murals, because these murals go way beyond simplistic depiction of folk culture or national pride, and these artists are really getting into immigration politics. So today I want to highlight one of the main things that unites these two mural projects when we look at them is that these two Croatian artists, who importantly were working closely with the parish priests at these two churches, they did not shy away from using their artistic platform to enter into contemporary discourse around immigration, race, and identity. In the period of increasing anti-immigrant rhetoric that was leading up to the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, artist Oton Iveković and the parish priest he was working with, Davran Krompotić, they wrestle with how to help this congregation of immigrant slaughterhouse laborers to be accepted as good Americans. And then when we turn to Vanka's paintings, in the wake of the vast American immigration restrictions of the 1920s, we're going to see how in comparison, Vanka and parish priest Albert Žagar worked to help second and third generation immigrants to figure out their place in the United States. So I'm going to start by going into some historical context of these two congregations and the origins of their murals and these dynamic partnerships between artists and priests that were happening in both of these institutions. Okay, so if we turn to the Kansas City context, the first Croatian migrants to Kansas City in the 1890s, they lived in a small district that got nicknamed the Patch. It was located in an area of Kansas City that was called the West Bottoms. And the West Bottoms was just, the West Bottoms contained the Kansas City stockyards, and the patch itself was basically in the backyard of one of the main meat packing plants where most of these Croatian immigrants worked when they first arrived. And this is the Armour meatpacking plant. If you're from Kansas City, you hear Armour a lot because there's a main boulevard in Kansas City named after this meatpacking plant. And I want to do a little aside for those who aren't from the Missouri, Kansas area. The stockyards and the meatpacking plants were located in Kansas City, Kansas. And Kansas City, Kansas is actually a much smaller municipality than Kansas City, Missouri. So if you hear people talking about Kansas City, they're talking about Kansas City, Missouri. But actually, all of these Croatian immigrants live in Kansas City, Kansas, and the meatpacking plants where they work are in Kansas City, Kansas. So for the sake of this presentation, when I say Kansas City, I mean Kansas City, Kansas. Michael Cecilia, a couple weeks ago, did a great job covering the history of Croatian immigration in his talk, but I'm going to cover some things that relate to these murals just to help us understand how immigration history relates to them. Again, to be clear, most of these Croatian immigrants from Austria-Hungary had been small-scale farmers, what we would likely call peasants when they arrived in the United States. Well into the interwar period, they are just doing small-scale farming, and they have very little opportunity for economic growth in Austria-Hungary. So the motivations for coming to the United States are mostly economic. When they arrive in the United States, they're mostly labeled as unskilled workers. And what does that mean? They get into the most dangerous and dirty professions that you can have in the United States. It reminds me of that Dirty Jobs show. If the Dirty Jobs show existed in the early 20th century, you could probably be looking at what Croatians were doing. And in this instance, they're working in slaughterhouses, and so this is incredibly dangerous work that they're doing. The West Bottoms, as you might have gathered from its name, is a very low-lying area of Kansas City, and so they have a devastating flood in 1903. The low-income communities that lived in the West Bottoms, which were mostly African Americans and immigrant communities, move out. Catholic priests are really instrumental in this, and Catholic priests are on the ground really encouraging these Croatians to save their money and buy houses and start families right across the river, right across the Kansas River in what's called Strawberry Hill. So in 1900, a group of Croatian immigrants had already decided at that point to found and financially support a Croatian national parish in Strawberry Hill. And so in 1905 is when St. John the Baptist will be completed in terms of its being built. And it will become the center of the growing Kansas City, Kansas Croatian community. By all newspaper accounts, St. John the Baptist was actually the largest Slavic church in the entire Kansas City metro area in the first decades of the 20th century. So, you know, Kansas City is not necessarily known as a Slavic community, but the Croatian community was one of the largest Slavic communities in Kansas. One of the noteworthy things that stands out when we compare these two church murals is that both of them were really the products of a partnership, an active dialogue between immigrant parish priest and academic Croatian artist. The St. John the Baptist murals were the result of this very advantageous and you can even label it transnational collaboration between the Croatian academic artist Oton Iveković and an enterprising immigrant Croatian priest whose name was Reverend Davran Krmpotić. Krmpotić had come to the United States in 1901. He had become parish priest in 1902. And, you know, he's a really interesting figure that I actually think is worthy of more study. He embodies many of the typical values of the first generation of Croatian immigrants who entered into the United States before World War I. What were these values? Well, I should point out that in his view, America was a land full of opportunity, both economic and political. And what you probably need to understand is that he was a staunch Croatian nationalist, which meant that it was probably harder for him to get a parish in Austria-Hungary, but easier when he comes to the United States. And he is really looking at all of these opportunities that Croatians receive in the United States through the lens of having understood the oppression that Croatians went through under Hungarian rule in Austria-Hungary. So in his mind, you know, like America has way more opportunities for these Croatians than they had had in Austria-Hungary. To this end, Krmpotić really aims to Americanize these recent Croatian immigrants that are in his congregation. And he does this in multiple ways. He tries to educate his congregation on the American political system. He basically has like reading groups with them to read about Croatian or the American political system. That sounds like a really fun book club. He was adamant about spreading the values not just locally within his congregation, but also nationally. So he published very regularly in Zajedničar, which was the Croatian Fraternal Union's newspaper. So he would publish things there very regularly. He published some books that were trying to explain Austro-Hungarian politics to Americans. He would translate American political documents into Croatian and publish those. And in line with this, you might see this in this quote here, it's also clear that he's staunchly anti-communist and anti-union. So we have things like this where he's speaking to the public and trying to point out that his people are law-abiding, there's not an anarchist or a socialist among them. They might beg to differ. Okay, in 1909, he decides to invite his old school friend Iveković to paint the interior of the church. So he had known Iveković from when they were living together at the same time in Zagreb. They had gone to school together. Iveković had just become a professor at the newly founded School for Fine Arts in Zagreb. He was a leading artist of the historicist generation, and to that end, he was known for focusing his brand paintings on historic events of deep symbolic significance for the Croatians. This is a painting that shows a sort of like somewhat mythic moment from Croatian history where they're giving over the Croatian throne to the Hungarian king. It's also significant that he seemed to relish this opportunity to come to the United States. And it's clear that he wanted to travel to the US to see the landscape and bring some of that American landscape over into his artwork. And he's quoted as saying in a newspaper article, "I want to paint the prairies and the Rockies and Yellowstone Park." So he's here for the American adventure. Okay, moving over to some background about Millvale. In some ways, comparing these congregations is a little like comparing apples and oranges, because I want to point out that from my research, it can be reasonably estimated that this Kansas City, Kansas community of Croatians in 1909 probably numbered somewhere between 1,800 and 3,000 Croatians. That's pretty small in comparison to this huge community of Croatians that we have in Pittsburgh, in Allegheny, in Pennsylvania more broadly. The largest Croatian immigrant enclaves are here in Pennsylvania. 1937 newspaper article estimated there's about 50,000 Croatians living in Pittsburgh around the time that Vanka's painting these murals. So in that way, we need to understand this is like a very different sized community. The working class immigrants who founded St. Nicholas as a national parish, also founded in 1900, although, as Anna pointed out, they built their church first, so they win that race. But as you all know, this is just one Croatian national parish, and there are many Croatian national parishes, or not many, but there are, I think, about 6 in Allegheny alone that served Croatian communities. These Croatian immigrants in Allegheny County generally worked in a very different industry than Kansas City. They're working in steel mills and working in mining, but also united by working in these very dirty and dangerous professions. Just like we see in Strawberry Hill, I think it's also helpful to think about the Millvale murals as a kind of partnership between artists and parish priest. In this case, it's this dynamic dialogue between Albert Žagar and Maksimilijan Vanka. In 1937, Žagar, who was a priest of Slovenian roots, he had been in the US for over a decade, and at that point, I should say he's Slovenian, but it's also right on the border of Croatia, so there's a lot of that makes them. His politics were decidedly different than Krmpotić's. He was progressive, and Žagar would recount that an experience in Italy under Mussolini's early rule meant that by 1937, he was already openly critical of fascism in Europe. And I think it's clear when we look at the murals that he and Vanka were also clearly critical of capitalist greed in the United States. So Krmpotić's outlook was marked by optimism about American opportunity. Žagar represented a more critical generation who have this understanding of the toll that American industry takes on the lives and livelihoods of American immigrants. And a quick side note here, we're looking at a newspaper article here. Both of these murals received an incredible amount of press in local newspapers. The Kansas City Star ran many articles about the Strawberry Hill murals. We see a ton of press, both locally and nationally, about the Millvale murals. We might ask ourselves, why is that happening? Why are they getting so much press? I mean, from my perspective, I think my observation is that both of these priests, both Krmpotić and Žagar, fostered these close relationships with the media in order to serve their congregations, serve these immigrant congregations better. And what they were really trying to do is to project positive images of their congregations in the community. And so they're cultivating these media relationships in order to do that. When the elders of St. Nicholas, with the guidance of Žagar, began the search for an artist to decorate the interior of the church, they decided to reach out to Vanka. And in this instance, Vanka and Žagar had been in Zagreb at the same time, but they didn't know each other then. But members of the congregation had seen Vanka's work in an exhibition that was held in Pittsburgh a couple of years before this. So that's their motivation for pulling pulling Vanka to do these murals. I will say about Vanka and Iveković, another strange coincidence of these two murals is that Iveković and Vanka knew each other. Iveković would have taught some of the courses that Vanka took when he was in the academy. And Vanka, though he's a generation younger than Iveković, he's eventually going to become Iveković's colleague at the Fine Arts Academy in Zagreb. So they'll teach alongside each other for a certain period of time as well, before Vanka immigrates to the United States. While Iveković's specialty was painting grand historic narratives, by the 1930s, Vanka is most known in Zagreb for painting images of folk culture. And I'm not sure, that the congregants in St. Nicholas would necessarily have known that when they commissioned him, but certainly that's going to play an element in what he paints here. And I think it's worth pointing out that St. Nicholas would have been a really important opportunity for Vanka. He had been struggling to find his place in the American art world, and this was really an opportunity for him to create a piece that would really get the attention that his artwork deserved. Okay, so let's start talking about what's in these murals and how it responds to the discourse around immigration. So, in the first decades of the 20th century, a new narrative of American immigration was coalescing that sought to make sense of the most recent wave of immigration. And I think it's helpful to understand here that Iveković in the Strawberry Hill murals, he's painting them in 1909, and this is really the peak of the wave of new immigration at the beginning of the 20th century. We think about 10 million immigrants entered the United States in the decade between 1905 and the start of World War I in 1914. This new narrative that's coming together sought to differentiate late 19th century wave of what were now being labeled as good immigrants originating in Western and Northern Europe, and to sort of differentiate those from turn of the century wave of bad immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. What does this boil down to in these people who are reacting to American immigration? Older wave of primarily English, German, and Scandinavian immigrants were framed as stereotypically hardworking, intelligent and skilled, reliable, and it all boils down to this idea that they can be easily assimilated into the United States. And those who were starting to argue to restrict immigration into the United States were labeling Slavic immigrants and Italian immigrants, Italian, Polish, Czech, Russian, Jewish, Slavic. They were labeling these as, a variety of other stereotypes, including the idea that they were all unskilled laborers, unintelligent, illiterate, immoral, more likely to be radical. What does this boil down to? It's a sort of existential crisis for the United States, this idea that Slavic immigrants cannot be easily assimilated into the United States. Even people like Woodrow Wilson, he was writing as a political scientist before his presidency, was saying things like, these countries of the south of Europe were disbanding themselves of the most sordid and hapless elements of their population, right? So some populating these ideas that these countries are sending the worst that they have to the United States. Sounds a little familiar. Okay, this is what Father Kropotkic and Oton Iveković are basically up against when they paint this set of murals in 1909. They're up against this spreading anti-immigrant rhetoric in the United States. Okay, I'm going to focus on what are the two transepts of the Strawberry Hill murals because they interact the most with this dialogue around immigration. But if people have questions about other parts of murals, both here in Millvale and at Strawberry Hill, I'm happy to try to address those in the questions. Well, we turn first here to the south transept. This is where we're relying on newspaper sketches, so I know they're a little bit hard to see, and I'll try to describe as much as I can what's in them. This adoration of the Christ child scene, which was in the south transept of Strawberry Hill, received a lot of press when this mural was being painted in 1909. Why did it get so much press? It was a nativity scene, and what Iveković tried to do is show the Holy Family just to the right of that center window. And then he has the three wise men to the left of that window. But on the two side panels, he's brought in a bunch of people who are actually also from the 20th century. So he's mixed people that were contemporaneous to Christ times with the early 20th century. A quick observation here, I mean, I think Vanka does some similar things when we look here at the murals in Millvale. Both of these artists are really interested in mixing biblical past and contemporary present. So we might think about that as a tool for Slavic immigrant churches in general. Okay, what was really getting the media's attention in the left-hand panel is that the biblical shepherds were backed by the most American of figures, especially in the eyes of romanticizing Europeans. They included a cowboy and two Native Americans, backed by the shepherds. And so our cowboy is described by the press wearing a white sombrero, the red handkerchief at his neck, and regulation chaps. Two Native Americans, quote, pictured with many bright colors, and one is wearing the feathered headdress of a chief. Okay, on the other side of the nativity, we see a number of figures that are working class figures from the 20th century, a mechanic, a general laborer, a miner, a priest, a businessman, and two figures in Croatian full dress. Notably, no one is obviously a meat packer, which I find very interesting choice by Iveković. He's not interested in depicting meat packers, but we have some working class figures. And Iveković is elevating these working class immigrant figures, these cowboy and Native Americans, to being witnesses of the birth of Christ. I'm going to draw your attention to an even more unusual depiction in this nativity scene, though, one that the media did not give a huge amount of press to, and that is the way that Iveković decided to show the three wise men who were at the nativity. So 10 years after the mural was completed, Father Kompotić was actually quoted describing these three wise men, and I will read you what he says here. They portray the wise men of the day of Christ. And at the same time, by their costumes, they represent the three leading races. The first one, kneeling by his scarlet cloak and English crown over yellow hair and ruddy face, represents the English race. The dark-faced man represents the nations of the East, and the last figure in the decorated robe represents the Slavic peoples. So Iveković had done this really curious thing. He took this late medieval Renaissance convention of sometimes depicting the figures of the Magi as kings from three different parts of the world, and he manipulates it. The kneeling magus in the foreground, usually the European king Melchior, is the English figure. The second middle-aged magus, who's usually depicted as the Asian or Middle Eastern king Caspar, now ambiguously represents the nations of the East, and the way that Iveković has depicted him in these two scenes, he wears a turban and appears to have dark skin, almost as if he's North African. Finally, Iveković replaced the youngest magus, Balthazar, who's traditionally shown as an African king, with a Slavic figure, which is something that, as far as I know, has never been done in the history of adoration scenes. If you find a Slavic wise man in an adoration scene, please email me. I would love to hear about that. By depicting these magi as English, Eastern, and Slavic, I would argue that Iveković took the medieval allegory of the three kings from three different parts of the world and made it into a contemporary allegory of three racial waves of American immigration. Okay. A little bit of context here. Why focus on race, and in particular, why focus on the Slavic race? Here, I think it's really important to note that from our 21st century perspective, this depiction of the three wise men might be a little bit difficult to understand, primarily because we have come to see Slavic immigrants as being white, right? But in the early 20th century, these Croatian immigrants occupied a much more ambiguous position in relationship to race. Legally, Slavic immigrants did largely have the privileges of whiteness, but socially and culturally, they were frequently differentiated from native-born white Americans. And just to give a Kansas City example from an article that I stumbled over in my research, this is a chart, I'm sure a very unscientific chart made by the Kansas City Star of how American Kansas City is. And they have sort of made these, they have blocked out how much of the population of each of these cities is native-born white to foreign parents, foreign white. And so whiteness, you can see, is not monolithic, right? It's like there are different ways to be white in the view of these early 20th century Americans. What's most important is Iveković, surely from Potić's input, created a narrative that ran counter to this new narrative coalescing at the beginning of the 20th century. So I want to point out, this is not a narrative that's saying Northern and Western European immigrants good, Southern and Eastern European immigrants bad. Instead, Iveković created this counter-racial story of American immigration, and it shows this series of successive waves of immigration that may differ in their age or maybe their experience in the United States. And we might even assume that the English king, being the oldest king still here, would assuage white Americans' views of themselves as primarily or originally white or Anglo-Saxon. But all are present at the birth of Christ, and all have sort of equal footing in this narrative. Interesting. Briefly, I'll also touch on the North transept of Strawberry Hill. And this is probably the painting where Iveković got to be most in his historicist element. These sweeping murals on the north side depicted the legendary moment from the Christian history of the Slavic peoples. In the central panel, we see the 9th century Christian Duke of Moravia, Rostislav, and Rostislav would be just to the left of that central window in the center square. And Rostislav is greeting Saints Cyril and Methodius, who are standing just to the right of that central window. Rostislav, he's shown standing in that central panel. He's surrounded by members of his court, and then we see his massive castle sort of wraps around to the next panel on the left. On the right, we have Cyril and Methodius, and one of the brothers is holding an open book in the foreground. Okay, Iveković chose to depict this famous moment from the lives of these 9th century Greek missionaries. They were sent to Moravia by Byzantine Emperor Michael III at Prince Rostislav's request to convert many in the region to Christianity, or so the story goes. This moment has come to be understood by many Slavic peoples as this momentous milestone that marks the conversion of Slavic people into Christianity. And so Saint Cyril and Methodius appear in many Slavic churches in the United States, both Roman Catholic and Orthodox. And they appear in the United States and in the Old World, right? So it's not unusual necessarily for them to appear in this church. But two things I want to highlight about Iveković choosing this story to paint in St. John the Baptist. One of the major stereotypes about Slavic immigrants was that they were immoral. Cyril and Methodius' conversion of Slavs to Christianity provides Iveković and Potić with evidence that we have enduring piety for these Croatian immigrants that goes back to the 9th century. One of the other things the story also battles, perhaps, in stereotypes of Slavic immigrants is this theme of illiteracy, that Slavic immigrants are illiterate. To be honest, Croatians did have some of the highest rates of illiteracy among Slavic immigrants, right? When we go back and look at that history, there is some truth to that accusation as it pertains to Croatians. But Cyril and Methodius are really interesting here. Rostislav charged Cyril and Methodius with translating the Croatian liturgy from Greek into the vernacular language of his people, creating what's called Slavonic or Old Church Slavonic. And this vernacular liturgical language became the basis for Cyrillic. So Cyrillic gets its name from Cyril. And that's why we have them holding open this book in front of them. Croatians will end up using the Roman alphabet, but Glagolitic, which is an early form of Cyrillic, was the vernacular language for centuries of Croatian. And so here, to me, Iveković's choice to include Cyril and Methodius seems to be really this nod towards the fact that we've also been a literate people since the 9th century, right? We've had a written language, a written vernacular language since the 9th century. I'm going to move over to talking a little bit about St. Nicholas, our content here, and how it relates to discussions around immigration. This commission, first for a set of church murals in 1937, and later an additional set in 1941, led to a radical and dynamic church mural program. Like Iveković's Strawberry Hill murals, Vanka's Millvale murals included this mix of traditional imagery, but also unique imagery that highlighted immigrant experience, labor injustices and inequity, and anti-war imagery. As I'm always pointing out about the Millvale murals, these are uncommon themes in the decorations of churches then and now. How did Vanka respond to the St. Nicholas's congregation? The St. Nicholas congregation's request for something of the Narod? How does he respond to this idea that he should depict some of the folk or nation? I think it might be interesting to point out here that both Iveković and Vanka really took time to incorporate motifs from folk textiles, something that's also not an uncommon tactic in Slavic churches, but we see that in both places, that they're pulling on historic Croatian weavings and embroideries and putting those motifs into the borders that you see around the church. And I will point out that we can see them so much better now that the restoration has taken place on the ceiling. You can really admire these folk motifs that Vanka incorporated into Millvale. As I mentioned earlier, before his immigration, Vanka was already known and had established a reputation for himself in Zagreb as being a painter of images of folk culture. And Vanka even goes so far as to reuse some of the compositions that he had composed before his immigration in the 1937 murals. So in particular, if we look at Nasha Majka, or Our Mothers, which is on the back wall of the church here, that is a direct copy of the painting that Vanka had made around 1918, 1919. And above me here, to the left of the altarpiece, Proliadny Blagoslav, or Spring Blessings. This was also a copy of a painting that he had completed much earlier before his immigration. In my dissertation, I was really interested in how Vanka used folkloric motifs in a changing political landscape. And he did this especially to support two major movements in Yugoslavia, Yugoslavism at the end of the Habsburg Empire, and then throughout the interwar period, he's really creating things that are in line with the ideas of the Croatian Peasant Party. But I think maybe what's more important for the theme of today's talk is that if we look at the original context of these transplanted works, Vanka was really interested in the political and social plight of the rural working class. And so that interest in the rural working class, he brings that into his painting of the church here, and that he's also interested in working class themes. He's interested in the exact type of people who are often migrating to the United States. Okay, the other thing I'll point out here is that I'm not going to go deep into Vanka's background, as I'm assuming some people have heard about that, but also if you haven't, come and take a tour so you can hear more about Vanka's background. I want to point out that spending a good chunk of your childhood with a Croatian peasant caretaker means that Vanka just has a decidedly different approach to depicting a folk or working class culture than Iveković did. Iveković, all of our academic painters like to paint folk culture now and then, but they're not painting it the way Vanka did because Vanka had a very different relationship to folk culture than they did. So he's painting it from a pretty authentic place, which is interesting. This is really clear if you read Louis Adamic's Cradle of Life, and I'll talk about Louis Adamic in just a second, but the first half of Louis Adamic's Cradle of Life is based on Vanka's accounts of his childhood, and as far as I can tell, they are very accurate. So the first half of that book is where you want to look to understand Vanka's relationship to folk culture. It's even more clear that Vanka's work went beyond only saccharine or nationalist depictions of folk culture when we look at how he grappled with immigrant experience. In the 1937 Millvale Murals, Vanka carefully placed his paintings to create comparisons between biblical past and American and Croatian present. And so here I really want to point out, in 37, he's wanting you to compare what you see in front with what you see in back. That's really important for him. One of the front walls on either side of the apse, Mary mourns the death of Christ in murals of the Crucifixion and the Pietà. This is mirrored on the rear walls of the church by two paintings of Croatian women mourning the death of their sons. Arguably, I would say, two of the most powerful images in the church are actually on the rear walls instead of on the front walls. To the left, we have Croatian mothers raise their sons for war. He is painting a group of women in folk dress gathered around the casket of a soldier, and they're visibly mourning the soldier who's missing an arm, has a bandage around his head. The viewer's eyes are then drawn to the background where we have rows of crosses marking graves that blanket the hillside and indicate to us the very heavy impact of war on Croatian villages, right? This is about how much Croatians have suffered in the wars leading up to and during World War I. To the right, we are supposed to compare that with these immigrant women in the United States gathered around the body of a young worker who's died in a coal mining accident. Vanka was quoted here as describing this painting. The coal mine scene comes from a disaster near Johnstown when 72 men were trapped in the explosion. The body of the son was the first brought to the surface. The mother is sorrowing over him, while at the same time sending his three brothers into the mine with a rescue expedition. We don't have evidence that this exact event happened, but he seems to be referring to an event from around that time period related to one of these industrial coal mining accidents. Okay, so importantly here, mixing biblical past, American and Croatian present in the Millvale murals. Vanka, who is this ever empathetic artist, seems to say that as urban Croatian American industrial workers are suffering in the early 20th century, so their peasant counterparts suffered in the Croatian homeland, and so has Mary also suffered. What's motivating him here? Why have these Croatian immigrants compare their lives to their countrymen in Croatia? And I think here, Vanka was very influenced by the writings and ideas of his close friend, the Slovenian-American socialist writer, Louis Adamic. I'm always arguing that Adamic plays a large role in the ideas that we see in Vanka's works here at Millvale. In the 1930s and 40s, the question of how second and third generation immigrants would find their place in American society really drove Adamic's work. What was the situation of American immigration by this point, by the 1930s? Well, our nativists had really won out in the 1920s, right? The Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 and additional acts that took place in the following years, they created very stringent immigration quotas for the first time. So we're pretty much wiping out Slavic immigration. reducing the number of immigrants entering the country to 2% of the 1890 United States population of foreign-born nationalities. So they're picking 1890 as the year because Slavic immigration is small at that point, and they're saying even 2% of that small amount of immigration is allowed. So pretty much Slavic immigration is wiped out by this point. These new immigration policies really underlie American identity as Western European whiteness. Okay, the 1937 murals really grappled with what Adamick and Vanka saw as the most pressing issue of the late 1930s. And so this is what Zagreb and Vanka are sort of up against, right? We talked before about what Iveković and Krpotić were up against. Zagreb and Vanka are here thinking about how to help these, their first generation immigrants who have been here for a long time, now getting to second generation immigrants, help them figure out how to make America maybe work for them. Maybe it's best to say it that way. Adams had warned in this 1937 Harper's Bazaar article that he wrote, without a vital sense of background, perennially oppressed by the feeling that they, second-generation immigrants, are outsiders and thus inferior, they will live outside the mainstream of America's national life. So the solution, as Adamick saw it, was a better education for second-generation immigrants about their Croatian culture. And I think in this 1937 mural program, Vanka did basically what Adamick was arguing for in that article. He was trying to give these second-generation immigrants, or immigrants who have been in the United States now for many decades, a better sense of a relationship of how their lives parallel to their fellow countrymen in Europe. Okay, conclusions here, drawing some parallels between Iveković and Vanka's murals. So when we compare the 1909 Strawberry Hill murals and the 1937 Millvale murals, both of these murals are utopian gestures in their early 20th century context. These artists and the parish priests that they worked with tried to communicate messages that they really hoped would improve conditions for their respective working class congregations, right? They were trying to create a message with their murals that would improve the situation for their congregants. They even share this tactic of mixing biblical past with the present. Iveković managed to turn the birth of Christ into an American origin story, which I love. And Vanka turned the suffering of Mary into the suffering of the Croatians in American industry and European wars. But these are two very different moments in the history of American immigration, before and after immigration restriction, meaning that imagining Croatian American immigrant identity has to take place differently now that these laws have drastically changed in the United States. So in 1909, the major obstacle for creating a Croatian American immigrant identity is that they're not being accepted as desirable fellow citizens. So Iveković is interestingly not painting necessarily for that community of slaughterhouse workers, but instead he's trying to reach beyond them and paint for the community, for Native American, what we're trying to say, Native-born Americans, and show them that these slaughterhouse workers can be good American citizens. He's selling that Slavic immigrants can be good Americans. In 1937, these were not newly arrived Croatians anymore who might turn around at any moment and return back to Austria, as a very high percentage of Croatians did. But instead, in this post-Johnson Reed Act era, we have second-generation immigrants staying in the United States, and they have to make the United States context work for them. So part of what I love about the Millvale murals is Vanka really seems to aim his murals primarily at that Croatian immigrant community. Like Iveković is aiming beyond that immigrant community to try to convince Americans to accept them. Vanka seems to be aiming his murals at the Croatian immigrant community. He shows what I would even label radical empathy for their struggles. And he's trying to help second-generation immigrants by connecting with their distant Croatian homeland, even as he's pointing out labor injustices and making the case for their rights in the United States. So these murals, again, went much further than any simple taste of the Narod. That might have been like the original request, just give us something of the homeland. Both of these congregations got artists who were willing to wade into the messy politics of American immigration for them, and I would even argue with them. Okay, I'm gonna leave off there today. Should I recognize it?
The Kansas City murals that he was focusing on enhancing the image of Croatian immigrants to the rest of the community. Mm-hmm. But if they're in a church, which is a Croatian church, and I assume that people that are going to that church are all from that community. Yeah. So there's a sort of a maybe, okay, was that the right venue for that kind of presentation?
I think that's where the relationship with the media really comes in. This idea that they'll get the media in there, the media will take lots of photographs when they can, or they're sharing new sketches actually, primarily at that point. And they're doing these long write-ups and descriptions. And what's interesting is that there's articles about those murals in Strawberry Hill, not only from 1909 to 1910 while they're being created, but also we see some like 5 years later, we see some 10 years later, so they keep coming back up in the press. So that would be my only response is like, yeah, you're right. It's a limited audience in the sense of like the weekly audience is going to be primarily Croatian immigrants, and I think they're trying to foster this relationship with the media so that they'll be seen outside that small circle.
I have a question. Were the Kansas City murals, were they like this all the way around the church, or were they just in one section? Do you know?
So I think this image shows you, they were all the way around the church. There was a seated Christ above the altar and Annunciation on either side of the apse. And then there were also ceiling murals, although there's no remaining image of the ceiling, but they had the 12 apostles and basically the vaulting of the ceiling. So I think it would have been a very immersive experience being in those murals. But I'm not, because we don't have very many extant images, I can't say if it was quite as, if it covered quite as much.
I just wondered because it took a year.
I wonder if part of that is difference in technique, but the size is kind of similar. Yeah, you raise an interesting question, which is why we need more images.
Do you know why that Croatians came to Kansas City? What was it that attracted them there?
Okay, what brought the first immigrants there? That, I'm assuming at some point, a form of chain migration started, because they all came from very similar region around, Livnik in Croatia, and so it's clear that they're telling family members about these opportunities, and so more are coming over. I think what's the chance? Because I do want to point out in Kansas City slaughterhouses, Croatians and African Americans were basically the two largest demographics in the slaughterhouses. And so I think it was Croatians were 22%, African Americans were 25%, and then we have some others, smaller Slavic groups and Germans and others who worked in the slaughterhouses. That was not the case when we look at Chicago or Omaha, which are the other two big spaces that are doing meatpacking plant work. Croatians are much smaller, represented in much smaller groups there. So I don't know the story of the first ones, but my assumption is someone found it to be a good opportunity and then they started bringing more from that region.
After the fires damaged the murals in the Kansas City church, what was the efforts was there an effort to paint something else? Was there ever consideration of having the artist come back?
And my assumption is it didn't appear to them to bring Iveković back, because that is close to the year that Capote passes away, and the end of Iveković is a pretty old man by that point. If you go in there today, like the first time I went in, I was so baffled because I was looking for these murals that I knew Iveković had painted. And so I went into the space and it's really austere. It's mostly white walls now. And there are just a few small murals. And I was like, is this the murals they're talking about? There's really not that much going on with these murals. You know, I was really kind of like when people go to the wrong St. Nicholas and they're like, are these the murals I heard of? Oh, there's just a few. So yes, they did not take it as an opportunity to have someone new come back and repaint the whole church. They just have a few murals that they it seems like they did at a later point. I don't know the exact date. So, yeah.
I wanted to ask about this kind of role of like history painting, because it's interesting that in the Kansas City church, there's this attempt to sort of reorient the whole history of Croatia, thinking about immigration to the US and thinking about this deep history, whereas like Vanka here is maybe thinking more about contemporary and biblical history together with this sort of like elision. Do you have a sense of why that might be?
And you're saying Iveković is taking a much more historical approach. She's like, I'm not just going to paint the contemporary moment. Instead, I'm going to try to paint this basically like a history of Slavic Christendom. I should say the overall theme of Iveković's murals at St. John the Baptist were all supposed to be about the adoration of Christ. Like it was all supposed to come back to that in the various parts of it. And so I think he saw Cyril and Methodius's, the depiction of Cyril and Methodius as kind of tying in with the Nativity, and that it was like bringing people to adore Christ, right? That was the overall theme. And when we look here, I feel like I don't have a good answer for you. Yeah, when we look here at Vanka's murals, you're right in that he seems much more interested in this contemporary moment. I mean, in part, I think it ties into what I'm pointing out at the ending, which is that he seems much more interested in speaking to working class immigrants in the congregation with his paintings. And Iveković is a much more traditionally elite artist, and I feel like he is interested in maybe more elite audiences than, I mean, I can't help but return to this fact that I'm so astounded that there's nobody who's obviously a meatpacker in the Strawberry Hill murals. And then, you know, if you go on a tour, they talk about all the ways that Vanka tried to integrate figures that he had sketched on the street, or sort of like pulled off the street to serve as the model for Christ, or the model for this this family dinner that's in the background. Like he really went out of his way, it seems to be, when we compared them, to integrate members of the congregation and really like speak to the congregation by doing that. I don't see the evidence that Iveković was nearly as interested.
One of the things that's so striking about this church is the centrality of the woman,
Yeah.
female. I mean, this church is a hymn to feminine strength, to the centrality of motherhood and of the family, etc. And I mean, certainly Vanka was very political, and Adamish even more so. That seems to me to be one of the, I'd like your reflections on what you think about the feminine side of this church.
When I wrote my dissertation, I also remarked on that. It was something that stood out to me. I noticed that Michael Cecilia also touched on that a little bit in his talk when he was talking about the traditional Croatian household, and that women played a very important role in it and were the conveyors of culture. I think there's definitely an element of that, this cultural perception that women are the bearers of folk culture. I think that's not totally, like, I don't know that Vanka's necessarily unique in that viewpoint, but what I do find striking about Vanka is that he doesn't necessarily give us pretty or sweet images of women in folk culture. He gives us like really strong images of women, and that does seem to be more unique to him and not something we would see in other academic Croatian artists who are trying to pick up folk motifs. They usually have like a little bit more delicate women, let's put it that way, right? And Vanka, you know, his folk women usually have very strong hands, very prominently placed. And I really love that. And I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I think it all goes back to the origin story. I think it has a lot to do with spending a good chunk of his childhood in a peasant household, peasant caretaker, primarily the woman in the household. And I think that has a lot of influence in his work. Yeah.
Yeah, Tom.
Hi, not a question, but really just a comment that I've been in, well, this is my parish, and my original parish was the other St. Nicholas down the street. That was an amazing church, but had nothing like this. But I think what I see is the two priests at these two individual churches, Karpotic and Zagreb, they really made the difference in presenting art like this. I've been in a lot of other Croatian churches, like Youngstown, Cleveland, they have, I don't want to, no distant, but they don't have art like this. And I've even been in the original St. Nicholas Church in Jastrzebarsko, where the people from, this church and the other church originated. They have murals, but they're nothing like this. They're pretty much your standard church murals. Again, nothing against them, but I just think that these two priests had the foresight or the vision, whatever you want to call it, to bring in, exceptional artists to decorate there.
It does seem like it takes a unique priest to have the vision that having a really intricate set of murals is not going to compete with what the church is doing, but it's going to help what the church is doing. I think we're always bringing up with Zagreb in the Millvale context is that he just gave Vanka an incredible amount of freedom. But it's also, I think, maybe a little bit more complex than that. He gave Vanka a lot of freedom, but he was obviously talking to Vanka about what he was going to paint. And I would love for more of that conversation to emerge in some kind of archival form so that we can know, what was Zagreb encouraging Vanka to do based on his own background? Because I think these anti-fascist themes that we're seeing coming through, especially in the 1941 murals, I see a lot of Zagreb in that. And again, this emphasis on members of the community, I'm sure that's coming out of Vanka would have shown up here as an unknown. So Zagreb is having to give him some of this, these introductions into the community. And so I think Zagreb probably did play quite a bit of a role, not in limiting Vanka's freedom, but encouraging him to pick up certain themes. Yeah. And Karpotic too, he was clearly a visionary immigrant priest. Pulling out some elements of his political viewpoints, but he is really trying hard to put these Croatian immigrants, to convince them to stay and not go back to Austria, but also to put them on the best footing that he possibly can. And his visionary idea to have a backup, his old friend to come over and paint these murals is really trying to project this image of them as refined and cultured because of what you see in the murals. Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Heidi.
Yeah.